Let's take a look at how you can validate props in Vue. So to start off, I have an app.vue component here, which is rendering an hello world component. And then inside the hello world component, we just render out hello. So the requirement here is to add the user's name to the hello world component, such as we'd like to say hello Owen or hello John, based on the user's current name. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass in a prop to hello world. I'll call that name. And for the purposes of the video, we'll always just pass in Owen. So now hello world is being passed a name prop. So in order to accept that name prop in the hello world component, we're going to declare it by typing props and then name, which is the name of the prop. And we're going to say that this name is a string. So this is the first way to validate prop types in Vue. I'm just going to render out the name while we're here, make sure everything's working. So the first way is we just declare the prop name and then the type, which is string. For example, if we check out our console, which we'll now clear and just refresh to make sure everything's fine. So let's change string to a number and see what happens. So when we say that prop's name should be a number, however, we pass it a string, Vue will give us a warning in the console saying, invalid prop, type check failed for prop name. Expected number with value not a number, got string with Owen. So that's the first way we can validate prop types in Vue, is basically just say this prop should be of this type. Now taking it one step further, if we wanted to declare multiple types, say it could be a string or a number, we could pass in an array. And we'll clear the console, refresh. And now we have no error because this time we actually passed in a string. But if we wanted to say be a Boolean or a number, we'd now get the error again because we're passing in a string. So you can pass in a single type or multiple types using an array. The next thing you can do is make props required. So by default, this name prop is not required. And if we did not pass it in here, nothing, there'd be no errors because technically this is correct because name is an optional prop. And by default, the value will be undefined, so nothing is rendered here. So to tell the hello world component that name is required, what we need to do is change our string type to actually be an object. So we'll call that an object, and then inside there we'll do type string and required true. Now this tells Vue that the prop name is required, and in our case, we're still not passing it in. So we get the error, missing prop required name. And to fix that, we can just pass in a name. If I could type. So there we go. We'll clear the console and re-render. Everything's good. So now our name prop is required. If you didn't want it to be required, but you wanted to provide a default, you could either turn required to false or just delete the line because required is false by default, and then provide a default value, which could be anything you want. So now if we go back to app and we remove the name prop, you can see that our default value is rendered instead of an error. What you can't do is say default value and required, because that doesn't make sense in Vue's eyes. You're saying that the prop is required, therefore it must be passed, which means the default value would never be used. So it's either default or required. So let's go back to providing it. We can remove our default value and we can leave required. It's true. The one caveat with default values is that if you're going to return an array or an object, you have to do that from within a function. So if, for example, we took a prop called person and it was an object, the default value we couldn't declare like this. So the reason why we can't declare a default object like this is because we're technically declaring a singleton right now. There's only going to be one instance of this object for the course of the runtime. What that means is that if a new hello world component were to be spawned, like say we made a second one here, both of these components would share the same instance of the object, meaning any changes or mutations to that object would apply to both. And that's not what we want to have happen. So instead, what we need to do is we need to return a new instance of that function. And you can do something like this. And then you could do hello person.name as the output. And then we get hello Owen. You could also just do function and have it return the object. Like so, and there's no formatting here, so I'll have to fix this like that. And that's, so now the default value is a function that returns an object, and then view behind the scenes is going to call that function for you. Same thing with an array. If you were to have type be an array, you would need to declare a new array in here. This won't render properly, but you get the idea. So I'm going to back all that out and just go back to the name like we had in the beginning. Default value we're not going to have. We're going to make it required. And then in our app, we'll pass in name. All right. Sure everything's saved. Refresh. Oh, rename it to name, of course. And it's not an array anymore. It's a string. All right. There we go. Refresh. Good to go. So the final thing I want to talk about is validation. In order to validate a prop, you can provide a validator function, and that first argument of the function will be the value of the prop. So I could say val here, and then return, and this function must return whether or not the value given is considered valid or invalid. So either true or false. So if we think that this value is true here, we can say true, and everything will be fine. Right? Or we could flip it and say false, and now this tells Vue that the value here is false, and therefore the custom validator check failed for prop name. So for instance, something you could do is say name was a status, and you're going to echo out a status here, but the status must only be either in progress or complete. You can say that index of, or actually includes, we could use val. And now what this says is that the value of this prop status must be either in progress or complete to be considered valid. And therefore status would come in here and we'd say in progress. And we'd refresh and everything's fine. But if it was, say, incomplete, which is not a valid status, only in progress and complete are valid statuses, we could save here, rerun, and see that the custom validator check failed. You'll notice, though, that it still renders properly. Vue doesn't prevent anything from rendering. It's merely just a warning. And on top of that, the validator does not run in a production build of Vue. So if you're bundling your application correctly and you're shipping it off to production, any code that you have in validator is stripped out during build time. The last thing to note with the validator is that the validation is ran before a component instance is created, which means instance properties such as data, if you're declaring it, or computed properties will not be available inside your functions. All right, so that is a quick overview of the prop validation in Vue. If you enjoyed it, please leave this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and follow me on Twitter @Owen Conti, and I'll see you next time.